Hey everyone, my name is Richard Kim. I'm a general partner at Galaxy Interactive. We have a venture fund, and we're currently investing our third fund with over 800 million under management. And today I want to talk to you about the idea of games and open economies. So I would say we're about 5 years into this movement now. When I first started investing in Web3 games, it was 2018. And I got excited coming from a financial and markets background where I was the COO of foreign exchange and emerging markets trading at Goldman and JP Morgan for several years. And I looked at gaming as a space and I thought, hey, this is a really interesting idea, the idea that we could combine open markets and trading together with what were previously closed loop economies in virtual worlds. So that was the thesis in 2018. And here we are, it's 2023. And unfortunately, I struggle to name a single game that met the original premise. And so, we're about 5 billion plus of investment into this space and seemingly no further along. And so I kind of want to talk about why today. For me, the best mental framing to understand why is this idea of what is the difference between a country and a currency and a company? Because to date, if you think about what the whole point of Web3 was, it was the idea of rewarding users of a network for their contributions. And you think about tokens and NFTs and some of these Web3 gaming primitives, and you ask yourself the question, have we actually done that? And I would submit to you the answer is fundamentally no. And I think the biggest reason why is because if you think about the business model of a country, right, it's really three things. It's to issue a currency, foment GDP, and then tax citizens, basically. But to get to that point, you can't also have the mentality of being a company and focus on selling apples to your customers, right? And I think the problem with Web3 gaming over the last 5 years is we've kind of double dipped. Everyone wants to be a country in the sense of issuing their own currency and creating these virtual ecosystems with billions of dollars of GDP. But they're in such a rush to sell things through pre-sales of tokens, NFTs, and even in-app purchases for fiat, that you really have this fundamental conflict between the idea of a newly created currency of a country, a virtual country, versus a for-profit company. And just like oil and water, I would submit to you that these two things don't mix very well. So what is then a potential roadmap for a path forward? In my mind as an investor, I kind of separate the world into kind of a bimodal distribution. I get excited about two things. One of them I'll talk about today, and the other I'll only briefly touch on. So let's start with the latter. I think very simple game loops where you have really almost casino-style games that are primarily skill-based games where there's a risk of loss. Where as you play, the mental model is something of a player-owned arcade. As you play this game, you kind of become co-owner in an arcade, or if you're a bit more pessimistic, in the casino as you play. I think these types of simple rewarded incentive models for games with very little live ops, so don't think World of Warcraft or RPGs, but more casual type of game loops. I think there's a real potential for these games to really take off. I kind of view them as like virtual vending machines, where a lot of what can come out is very much a function of just who interacts with the thing and how much flow is going through them. So I won't talk about that kind of simple end of the spectrum today, but it's something that I'm personally quite interested in exploring, particularly with some of these more crypto native primitives like ZK and trustless kind of models where you don't have to rely on a developer or any one entity for the game to succeed. On the other end of the spectrum, though, going back to the country versus company thing, I'm really fascinated by this idea of, okay, if you wanted to build a country and a currency for that country that's sustainable, what would you have to do? And a few months ago, I wrote a blog on what I called the 10 commandments of open economy games. And to me, these are the necessary kind of conditions precedent for sustainable economic flows. Because fundamentally, how I think about token-based economies is If you abstract away any speculation at all, it's neither positive nor negative, and all you're left with are organics, players or other users. What is the reason for these people to buy your currency? Because fundamentally, if there's no reason for organic payer demand, there's just not a lot of sustainability in your model. So, in the case of a game, the way I put this is what I call the first principle of GDP before GMV. So, if you think about what is the GDP in a game, it's some of the intrinsically motivated loops around crafting, exploration, buying, building, selling, and doing so not for speculative profit and these kind of extrinsic make a quick buck by flipping an NFT type of flows we've seen, but more kind of the intrinsic game loops where you have players feeling rewarded for all that joy in the game. And so I was talking to Hilmar at CCP, and he put it quite well one time, because if you remember about a year ago, there was this meme that, it was never about play to earn, it was about play and earn, because a game has to be fun. As if, you were saying something insightful by saying a game had to be fun. But that's actually, not really interesting at all, because saying a game has to be fun is a bit like saying food should be tasty, right? It's so obvious as to be functionally meaningless. And so, for me, it's more about what are the verbs that get people excited to play your game, whether it's learning, acceleration, frustration, and inspiration, and how do you tap into these player emotions in a way that doesn't just boil down to money. And so that's what's kind of hard in an open economy, because money is a very hard motivating factor. It's a very hard extrinsic motivator. And a lot of times when you think about games like, I play a lot of Clash Royale on my phone, if I had to be thinking about, what is the value of this kind of purchase going to be in 7 days based on what the market price is going to be, it's just a fundamentally different mindset that not a lot of gamers want to be in. So I think it's very important to build up that kind of GDP, as I say, before GMV or just the kind of trading layer of the game. And unfortunately, in crypto, we've done the exact opposite. If you just plotted GDP to GMV as a ratio for almost any Web3 game, it's basically the GMV is so high that you basically have no real activity. So I think we need to play more with ecosystems that don't have full tradability day one, and kind of de-emphasize liquidity a bit, and more about the idea of earning into a stake in some network. Just like, as a seed stage investor, you wouldn't necessarily expect to be able to flip your equity on day 2, right? And so I think retail just fundamentally is not very ready for that idea of constantly being able to sell. And so designs need to be adjusted accordingly. I think fundamentally these types of open economies, they work much better in multiplayer environments that maximize for intrinsic motivators, as I've said, as opposed to kind of like idler loops or PvE, just like click a button and farm type of loops. I really can't understand why so many Web3 games are trading card games. I think fundamentally I think it's like 90% of games being built are trading card games from just my anecdotal observation. And I don't even think that's a particularly good type of loop. So a kind of design that maximizes more for emergent interactions, I think is going to be quite important. I think this idea of risk of loss is the third principle I would emphasize. The idea that you need violence, to use a bit controversial of a word, at the core of the game, I think is very important, because if it's only about earning more of everything, then who are the organic players going to sell to? So going back to my point about organic payer demand, I think one of the most important things in any game with an open economy is real sinks. And I would say that a lot of the quote sinks I see in Web3 games are more like transformations, like take X amount of tokens or gems and upgrade your character with it. And I don't actually view that as a real sink, because there's no risk of loss. And so you just have this infinite power creep, and it just doesn't really work very well. I think the question on the fourth idea that all player is or all currency is player owned is very important, because otherwise you're going to have an issue where you have very lumpy distribution, and you have a huge amount of currency being owned by investors, team, exchanges, and I think that's one of the things that's really most broken about a lot of Web3 games. The fifth point is one about how items come into existence. So one issue I see a lot is you have a developer of a game and it's completely up to them on what to decide, what to sell it for, whether US dollars or tokens. And this question of where does value accrue is just completely unclear. And so an economy where the virtual goods are much more about player crafting, I think is going to be quite important. The sixth point is about this idea of separation between the Fed and the Treasury, right? Because if you think about it, the developer has two roles. One is they need to have a balance sheet to do things like fund and develop the game. And then the other is more in their role as Fed, as like being able to adjust the rate of inflation and monetary policy generally based on real activity in the system. And I think it's very important that these two roles not be conflated and that there be transparency about when they're acting, in what capacity, and under what constraints. The seventh point I would make is about legal entity structuring. I think one of the reasons that tokens and NFTs don't work is because tokens don't actually give you the right to anything in the vast majority of cases. And so having a structure where real economic value can be redistributed to players is, I would argue, a real gating item for the original premise of Web3 gaming to attain. I'm personally quite fascinated by the idea of legal cooperatives as opposed to traditional corporations, given securities law issues with distributing economic value through dividends or otherwise back to users. Whereas cooperatives, the mental model is almost where your players are like workers in a cooperative. And because everything is actively earned, there's much less of an argument that these are unregistered securities offerings. So something worth drilling into. The eighth point is one of alignment of the player and speculator archetypes. Basically, what's great about DeFi and Web3 is it's a fully adversarial model. And so, I don't think any game can survive if you craft this artificial distinction between a, quote, player and speculator. So you really have to assume that everyone is going to kind of be a speculator and change your design accordingly to be resistant to that. The ninth principle is one of how do these games monetize? I really believe in the idea of VAT based monetization, so a taxation on kind of trading activity, as opposed to things like pre-sales or in-app purchase sales. Because again, when you are taking a tax on things that are happening in the real economy, I would say that the interests of the developer and the players are aligned. And then the last point I would make is one of proof of humanity, because at scale, when these ecosystems get super real and real GDPs flowing through them, things like FinCEN guidance on virtual currency issuing and KYC, AML, all of these things really start to become an issue, together with the idea of how do you prevent bots from creating a bunch of dupe accounts and earning a bunch of money for this or that. So all of these things are complicated problems, but definitely need to be thought through. So yeah, just that kind of wraps up what I wanted to say. I think it's really hard to get all of these 10 things right, but I think the ones who do it first are likely to create massive ecosystems that really excite me and kind of fulfill some of the original promise of Web3 gaming. So I'd love to chat with any of you about this more. You can find me on Twitter at GalaxyRTK or Telegram, KRYPTOLITE. Thanks very much.
Any questions? We have time for a few questions. Okay.
Hey, great talk. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. You mentioned that the road to Web3 gaming has been around for a while. like 5 years we've been thinking about it, and it seems like recently there are some now high quality games coming out, like very competitive multiplayer ones. So I was wondering what you thought about onboarding like professional and semi-professional gamers who can be competitive within like an esports environment, how tokenization can incentivize them, and perhaps also some of the regulatory aspects surrounding that, particularly when you're doing risk-to-earn models, gambling, betting pools, essentially, on some of these professional gamers.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the things that excite me the most, as you hit on, are the kind of risk-to-earn type of models. The problem with that is the rules on gambling versus skill-based gaming are very nuanced. One of our portfolio companies is in this space, in the Web 2 space, and if you look at the 50 state legal opinions, they all differ, right? And there's at least 4 different categories of whether something's predominantly luck or skill. And that's just the US, right? Then you have to look at Japan, Europe, everywhere. So I personally think that if you really wanted to experiment with this properly, I'm much more a believer in the kind of simple loop model that I didn't talk about today, of release a kind of blockchain-based vending machine and let the world interact with it and see what emergent things might happen, because it's just too hard to get around the regulatory stuff otherwise. Just practically speaking, where you see this come up a lot is a lot of the Web3 shooters. It's a space I personally am very bearish on because of the risk of cheating. If you look at Riot Games, they spent 1 of every 6 people building Valorant was focused on anti-cheat, and that's Riot, right? I mean, what chance does a Web3 gaming studio have to really outcompete in this space? So I don't think it's going to be shooters.
Thank you. We still have time for another question because the next speaker didn't reach yet. Okay. No question? Fine. Thank you.